The Storm So Long by Leon, let me turn that over, Leon Litwack. Okay. And we are reading from chapter 4, Slaves No More, beginning of section 5. Um, so, hi. No matter how easily the old paternalism might adapt itself to new realities, the death of slavery remained difficult to accept. The slave owning class had always included in its ranks men and women of varying degrees of temperament and mental stability, with the vast majority falling somewhere between the legendary gentlemen and sadists. Understandably, wartime tensions, privations, and personal tragedies had taken their toll and left many white families shattered, bitter, angry, and betrayed. Now, in addition to the other calamities which had been visited upon them, they faced the loss of their slave property and perhaps their labor force. That proved to be more grief than some masters and mistresses were capable of handling. After acknowledging their freedom, Big Jim McCain, a Virginia planter, asked his more than 100 slaves to continue to work for him. None of them expressed a willingness to remain, not even to harvest the current crops. At this affront, the pent-up bitterness in McLean suddenly exploded. Seizing his pistol, he fired wildly into the crowd of terrorized blacks, killing some outright and wounding others. When finally restrained, McLean tried to take his own life. At this point, several blacks promised to stay for another year, and that seemed to placate him. But Union troops would have to intervene before he would permit any of his former slaves to leave the plantation. Although few of their masters reacted as violently, newly freed slaves had little way of knowing what to expect. The violent outburst of a McLean, based on his record as a slaveholder, probably surprised none of his blacks. But Matt Goud, on the other hand, had treated his 3 slave families like they were members of his own family. At least that was how Anderson Edwards remembered him. Quote, "The other inwards called us Major Goud's free inwards," end quote. Goud had no sooner heard of emancipation, however, than he began to curse his blacks vigorously, proclaiming that the Almighty had never intended such a thing as, quote, free inwards. And, as Edwards recalled, his master cussed till he died, end quote. After enduring a hard bondage, which included being sold 6 times, Jane Simpson expected no help from her last owners, a temperamental mistress and an alcoholic master. Anticipating no change in their attitudes, she learned soon after emancipation how accurately she had assessed their character. Like most of the slaveholding families in the neighborhood, she recalled, quote, "Dey was so mad 'cause dey had to set 'em free. Dey just stayed mean as dey would 'low 'em to be, anyhow, and is yet most of them," end quote. Not surprisingly, the plantation mistresses, many of whom suddenly faced the unpleasant prospect of doing the cooking and housework themselves, often reacted with even greater resentment than their husbands, belying what may have been left of their reputation as the benevolent half of the household. Although the master, quote, took it well, a former South Carolina slave recalled, the mistress, who had lost 2 sons in the war, quote, just cussed us and said, "Damn you, you are free now," end quote. At the same time, the mistress of a Georgia plantation, where some 200 slaves had resided, gave every indication of losing her mind after her husband acknowledged the emancipation decree. Quote, "I remembers how she couldn't stay in the house," Emmett Hurley remarked. "She just walked up and down out in the yard, a carrying on, and talking and a raving," end quote. To believe the testimony of former slaves, some of their masters and mistresses never did recover from emancipation, but died shortly thereafter from, quote, heartbreak and grief. Miss Polly died right after the surrender, a former Virginia slave recalled. Quote, "She was so hurt that all the Negroes was going to be free. She died hollering Yankee. She was so mad that she just died, end quote. Similarly, Isaac Martin, who had been a slave in Texas, remembered that his master, quote, didn't live long after they took his slaves away from him. Well, it just killed him, that's all, end quote. In these instances, as in many others, it remains unclear whether the heartbreak was induced by the loss of the slaves with whom the white owner thought they had intimate ties, the loss of property, and the suddenly dim economic prospects, or fears engendered by the thought of 4 million free blacks. More than likely, the grief stemmed largely from a sense that the world as they had known it was collapsing all around them. Nevertheless, whatever the actual cause of death, the former slaves had their own ideas. Within 10 or 15 days after his freed slaves began to leave him, Massa Harry Hogan was dead, and one black he owned attributed it to, quote, all the trouble coming on him at once, end quote. Within 3 weeks after the slaves on an Arkansas plantation heard they were free, they buried their mistress. Quote, the news killed her dead, one of them recalled. And when, quote, Master, end quote, Billy Finley returned from the war, his brother had been killed in action, only to find the slaves freed and most of them leaving the plantation, he seemed unable to cope with reality. His mother found him one day in the shed, his throat slashed, and beside him the razor and a note which revealed that he did not care to live, 'cause the inward free. To attribute the deaths of masters and mistresses to grief over the loss of their slaves poses obvious difficulties, despite the exactitude with which some blacks were able to pinpoint the occurrence. Still, the reported instances of this kind in the recollections of former bondsmen occur too frequently to dismiss them altogether as flights of fantasy or faulty memories. What remains crucial is that so many ex-slaves chose to recall the death of a master or mistress in this way, as if to suggest that their white folks had been so depressed on them that they were unable to conceive of a future without them. Quote, old mistress never get well after she lose all her inwards, Katie Rowe recalled. Quote, and one day the white boss, the overseer, tell us she just drop over dead sitting in her chair, and we know her heart just broke, end quote. Such testimony such testimony differed in no significant respect from how Duncan Clinch Hayward remembered the death of his grandfather, who had been one of the largest rice planters in South Carolina. As my grandfather sat on the piazza of his house in Watersea, his former slaves dropped on their way to the station to bid him goodbye. All they said was that they were going home and look for him soon. He never returned to Combahee and did not see them again. Okay. Sorry, I am drowsy and dozing off as I read, just like I do at home. He never returned to Combahee and did not see them again. Broken in health and staggered by his losses, Charles Hayward could not recover after the final blow. The emancipated slave could look forward to a better day for himself and his descendants, but the old slaveholder's day was done. He soon went to his grave, and his traditions and his troubles were buried with him. End quote. Although dismay and anxiety over emancipation were hardly uncommon, not all slaveholders shared these fashionable ailments in the same degree, and only a few permitted the shock to drive them to suicide or a premature death. Several months after Appomattox, Josiah Gorgas, the former Confederate chief of ordnance, discussed recent events with a wealthy Alabama planter and found himself much troubled both about himself and about the future of the white race in the South. now that his slaves had been freed, he seemed to think that his entire life had been wasted. Quote, this state of mind is natural and leads to despondency in his case. George Gorgas confided in his journal after the conversation. But not, quote, but not so in the case of most planters, end quote. In his recent travels, Gorgas had been generally pleased by the conduct of the planter class, particularly their equanimity in the face of disaster. Here were Yankee officers coming onto their plantations, meeting and talking with their slaves, telling them they were free, and promising to protect their new rights, while former masters made no protest, but avidly questioned the officers about their new relations with the blacks. It all seemed like a, quote, gigantic dream. 4 months ago, Gorgas reflected, quote, that Yankee captain attempting to make such an address to their slaves would have been hung on the nearest tree and left there, end quote. But the readiness with which Gorgas perceived the planters adapting themselves to the new conditions could manifest itself in many different ways, not all of them consistent with the image this class had long tried to cultivate. As slaveholders, many of them had preferred to view the, quote, peculiar institution as an obligation and a burden, binding them to feed, clothe, and protect the blacks in return for their labor and obedience. It is the plantation mistress who in a moment of in a moment okay the plantation mistress who in a moment of I'm not sure where I left off, but the phone cut out. I'm back on. Hopefully I'm going to pick up where I think I left off. As slaveholders, many of them had preferred to view the peculiar institution as an obligation and a burden, binding them to feed, clothe, and protect the blacks in return for their labor and obedience. The plantation mistress, who in a moment of exasperation screamed, quote, it is the slaves who own me, end quote, gave perfect expression to that sense of burden. The slaveholding class had always taken considerable pride in its treatment of elderly slaves, contrasting such benevolence with the crassness of northern employers who cared neither for the aged nor the sick, but turned workers onto the street when they ceased to be productive. Actually, few slaves lived long enough to constitute a burden on their owners, and even the aged slaves often performed tasks that defrayed the costs of their upkeep. When his grandmother was no longer able to work, Frederick Douglass recalled, her owners manifested their gratitude for her many years of service by removing her to the woods, where they built her a little hut, put up a little mud chimney, and then made her welcome to the privilege of supporting herself there in perfect loneliness. Whatever the quality of care owners had bestowed on their elderly slaves, emancipation, as some viewed it, absolved them of any further responsibility. If the blacks were no longer his slaves, the master might feel neither the compassion, the gentlemanly compulsions, nor the economic need to provide them with the same degree of protection, sympathy, and support. None expressed it more graphically than the Georgia planter who burned the slave cabins to the ground and expelled the occupants from the plantation. Nor did Will Davison, a Texas planter, refrain from making himself clear on the day he freed his slaves. Quote, well, you black sons of bitches, you are just as free as I am, quote, end quote, he declared, as he promised to horsewhip any of them he found on the place the next morning. And that is where I'm going to stop. So, good night, Devon. Sleep tight. Don't let the chappy bite. And I love you. Mwah. 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 Sweet dreams.